Hello, my name is Stephanie Creary, and I'm an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. And I'm very honored to have today here with us Dr. Rohini Anand, who is currently Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisor and former Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer at Sodexo. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Rohini. I'm so happy to have you with us.
Wonderful to be with you, Dr. Creary. Just really delighted to be part of this conversation.
So what many people don't know is you and I actually know each other pretty well, and our history goes back to 2008. In 2008, I was both a research associate at Harvard Business School and also a research associate at the Conference Board in New York City, studying companies' global diversity and inclusion strategies. And so you were somebody who had both been a presenter and an expert at the Conference Board, sharing with your colleagues some of the good work that you all were doing at Sodexo, particularly as you wanted to think about broadening your scope from U.S. domestic-focused diversity strategies to global-focused strategies. But then also, you were somebody who we had at the time, the professor I'd been working for, Professor David Thomas, who's now president of Morehouse College, we'd been doing a body of work that was focused on trying to understand how companies like yours were trying to scale these U.S. strategies more globally. And so one of the things that happened at that time and around the 2008-2009 period is we started interviewing you and many of your colleagues at Sodexo who had been doing some of the work in the U.S. and certainly were focused on the global strategy. But where I wanted to start today was to talk a little bit about some of the early work that you did at Sodexo, because I think so much of that is related to the experiences that many of us are having now, personally in our companies around racial justice. But before we get there, I want to note to everybody that Rohini and her CEO and her company, they were kind enough to sign off on a wonderful Harvard Business School case study. It's called Shifting the Diversity Climate, Sodexo Solutions. So you could read more about the extensive work that Rohini and her colleagues did between the years of 1999 and 2010. We'll just preview a little bit of that here before we lapse into a conversation about the current time. Sound good, Rohini?
Sounds wonderful, Stephanie. Great.
Okay, so let me take us back to around early 2001. And at that time, Michel Landel was president and CEO of Sodexo North America, correct?
Right.
Okay,
Yes.
And he had recently hired as he referred to his good friend, Ollie Lawrence, to be Sodexo's North America Chief Human Resources Officer. And one of the things that really struck me when I had interviewed Michel way back when was he talked about this friendship that he had with Ollie Lawrence, who described himself as an African-American male. Michel Landel was Belgian, I believe.
No, he's French.
He's French. He is French. My apologies. So Michel Landel was French. And so he talked about some of his early learnings about racial equity and racial inequity came from this friendship that he had with Ollie Lawrence. And so it was really, for him, quite an emotional experience when in 2001, your company, Sodexo, was notified that a class action lawsuit had been filed in DC against Sodexo, which was then called Sodexo Marriott Services. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about that time period for the company, and then you came in shortly thereafter. So can you give us a little bit of a reflection on what that felt like? I know we're reflecting back 19 years, but certainly I'm sure it was a very remarkable period in your career.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I think that context is actually wonderful and really very relevant to what's happening today in the world around us. For multiple reasons. But I joined Sodexo in 2002. And about 6 months after I joined, the lawsuit was certified as a class action. And we ultimately did settle in 2005, and there was a 5-year consent decree after that. But I would say that, it was a a discrimination lawsuit filed by African American managers. It was a promotion discrimination lawsuit. And that certainly was a very painful time in the company's history. But it was also a time of incredible learning, incredible growth. And I think much of this had to do with the leadership, so with Michelle. And, you're absolutely right. I think this, so it was his sort of personal transformation that brought him to an understanding, somewhat of an understanding of race relations in the US. I don't think that he will or anyone will say that, he fully understood it, but I will say that he began his journey and his friendship with Ollie and the experiences that Ollie shared. And then Michelle, being the sort of humble leader that he is, was able to listen and to learn and to internalize some of those messages, really helped in his growth. So, Michelle actually grew up he was born in Morocco. He lived in Africa for many years, was, leading the business in Africa, but had a very, very different understanding of race outside of the United States. And I think that different understanding of race continues even today with what, we see happening in Europe and France, et cetera. We can, get more into that. But that particular time period, I think it was an opportunity. It provided a springboard. It was a burning platform. But I have to say that the organization could have just sort of stopped and said, let's do these 10 things that we're required to do, and we're done with it. But I along the way, I think that there were enough leaders, enough of a critical mass that had begun to sort of personally engage on the topic, that they and reflect on the topic. And they actually helped to change the culture within Sodexo. So it was a transformation, a cultural transformation, a systemic change to the organization, processes, policies, systems, individual behaviors and actions that ultimately impacted sort of this cultural transformation. And, I suppose the proof is in the pudding in terms of what it is today in terms of representation, in terms of, behaviors, in terms of, what our surveys say about how African-American employees feel about being at Sodexo, but also the named plaintiff in that lawsuit continued to stay at Sodexo. And, she says that I would not have if this, culture had not changed, transformed the way it had. So, I think it was difficult, but I do think that it positioned diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that became an enabler for the business, but also an enabler for changing the culture in the organization. And, clearly it had to be led from the top. The leadership had to be completely committed. And it wasn't like they kind of, suddenly woke up and understood what the issues were or what the African-American employees were going through. It was a process. And, I can talk a bit about that process, but it was a journey for each and every one of those leaders.
So we'll get back to some of the specific policies and systems that you put in place when we set ourselves in the current time, because I know so many individuals or leaders are interested in, so when we're talking about systemic racism, what do we mean by systems and how do we change it? So I'm going to give you the opportunity in a little bit to reflect on some of the specific 2 to 3 things you did, and then would you still do those things now? But before we go there, I want to actually bring up something else that I've been thinking about a lot lately. As I said, I've been thinking a lot about your case as I've been watching the world unfold around us, because I remember all of the work that it took for Sodexo and for you and Michelle to gain traction on talking about diversity in France, in getting people outside of the United States to believe that diversity was not just a U.S. thing, that it was something that was meaningful in their own culture. And so I will never forget this idea that for so many people around the world, when you tried to talk about diversity, it was, that's a U.S. thing, that's not necessarily our thing. And I look today, there are protests, Rohini, in France. There are protests in London. There are protests all around the world in many of these jurisdictions where I know you and your colleagues at other organizations had a very hard time getting them to believe that diversity affected them as well. So could you reflect a little bit on perhaps that journey, the work that you had to do, and maybe what you're thinking now as you're seeing all these countries embrace a Black Lives Matter movement and certainly making it their own with respect to their own cultures and ethnicities?
Yeah, so I think I've been thinking a lot about that. And when we started this work, when we started the global work, you're right. It was incredibly challenging, and particularly challenging in Europe, where, you're not allowed because of data privacy issues to collect data on race or ethnicity. But apart from that, the word diversity, more so the word race or ethnicity, does not translate within the context of many European countries, where individuals are identified by their individual experiences, so as an immigrant or of a particular nationality, versus being identified by a collective identity as belonging to a particular ethnic group. So given that there's no data on representation of how many, Black people there are, for instance, in the organization, there is no acceptance around talking about these issues, because they would, say that this is a U.S. issue. We don't have race issues in our country. And I remember clearly when they had the youth riots and demonstrations around in the suburbs of Paris. And, with those demonstrations, and when I pointed that out, they would just sort of dismiss that as, it has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with color. It's all about culture, as, the French would say. If you have the right culture, you're French or you're not French. So it's sort of, just the whole category of race and ethnicity does not translate in many parts of Europe. In fact, and I believe it's in Sweden, where the word for race actually is synonymous with the word for discrimination.
Wow.
So I mean, that's a challenge. And so we used many different ways to unpack that. But I will say there are not that many organizations, Stephanie, that actually do go deep in addressing issues of race in many countries, like in Europe in particular, because of data issues. UK, right. Yes, but not elsewhere. Now, if we fast forward to today, and so, yeah, they saw me, and I think I shared this in the case study, that when they talk to me, right, the Europeans, and particularly the French, when they talk to me, they saw me as Indian, because I am of Indian origin. And they embraced me, and they shared all kinds of things, some stuff which was not very complimentary to Americans. But when it came to issues of diversity, their guard went down, and they saw me as American. And this was, this is just a U.S. thing. It's irrelevant in our country. See how. And the interesting thing is, there's a lot more intermarriage in parts of Europe, in France, for instance, between blacks and whites. So that becomes sort of a data point for them to talk about the fact that, it's an integrated society, for instance.
Right.
So fast forward to today, to be honest, I have a lot of hope for what's to come in the U.S.
Yeah.
I think just looking at the demographics of the demonstrators and the allies that are there and the young generation, I'm very hopeful right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Not the same globally. It is a movement. I think there are people that are demonstrating, in all parts of Europe, for instance, but I'm not sure that that's being translated within organizations. I think there's still compartmentalization between public and private. Mm-hmm. And it's, they're doing this, demonstration on the street, but as far as we're concerned, as an organization. So I'm not sure how and what's going to change that. It has to change, because it is going to spill over into organizations. But I'm watching to see, how organizations start now addressing issues of color, race, underrepresented populations within their organizations. But
it's really helpful to hear, and I know the points that you're making around data privacy. It's, as a researcher, this is not an area. Doing research in Europe is not easy, particularly as somebody who studies diversity and inclusion. I'm just not going to get the data that I want to get. I can certainly get data on gender, but the issues that I'm interested in aren't always about gender, right? And so I think about, even now, as we're obviously living under the other pandemic, all right? So not just the racism pandemic, but certainly the coronavirus pandemic. I've seen a number of papers put out in the UK where they refer BAME. I'm not sure if it's pronounced BAME, but BAME. BAME is the acronym for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, I believe, individuals in society in the UK. And so I see in the UK, papers that are suggesting that there's inequity in terms of who has to work and who's being negatively affected by the disease.
Right. So I think in the UK, their census, I think, comes out, if I'm not mistaken, next year. They're going to have their next census. And the predictions are that, about 20 to 25% of the population is going to be identified as BAME, which is a massive number, right?
Yeah.
In the UK, organizations are definitely addressing these issues. In fact, I was talking to an organization today, which is, a 350-year UK-based organization. And they were talking about how they're having these, town halls with the CEO on race, and then asking each of their leaders in each of their lines of business to have these conversations as well.
Right.
So, and they're not jumping to action. They're doing these listening sessions. So they really want to hear people's experiences and be able to internalize them. So I'm thinking that, it's picking up there. Now, Sodexo, I know that this morning, one of the leaders was actually doing a listening session talking about issues of race. And, they've had, several anti-racism webinars, history of race in the US, leaders talking about making themselves vulnerable and talking about their own blind spots. So organizations are beginning to have these conversations globally as well, but I don't think in all parts of the world. I think we still have a ways to go there. So
excellent. So let's talk a bit about the work that has been done, needs to be done. I will tell you, I've taken a very crude cut of organizations when people who have interviewed me have said, are these statements, these CEO statements going to work? Is diversity training going to work? And you may not agree with my categories, and certainly we can leave this open for discussion. But I've given 3 categories of companies. I will call the first group the veterans. That's Sodexo. That's a company that for decades has had policies and practices in place to not only just manage diversity broadly, but also specific to issues around race and culture and ethnicity. I call those the veterans. The second group I refer to as the aspirants, right? Those are the companies that perhaps in the last decade or so have started to have a conversation about diversity. Much of that conversation might be about gender. I think of a lot of the tech companies in Silicon Valley. That's where they started. And certainly it was because there was heightened attention to gender discrimination and sexual harassment. And then the last group, I talk about these as the sideliners, right? And the sideliners are the companies that are really maybe tiptoeing around a conversation about diversity and inclusion. Some are paying attention. Some are less aware. And I think when I think about all these companies that have put out these statements around Black Lives Matter and let's get rid of systemic injustice, I've seen companies that fall into each of those 3 categories put out these statements.
What was the second? What was the second?
Is the aspirants, like aspiring aspirants. Yeah. So I call it the veterans, the aspirants, and the sideliners, like people who are sitting on the sideline just watching everybody else play the game. I'm most hopeful about the veterans. I'm most hopeful about companies like Sodexo and your capacity, that your former company's capacity to actually begin to create structures and policies and affect change. I'm not as hopeful about the sideliners who haven't, maybe they have a diversity officer, maybe they don't have a diversity officer, maybe if they have a diversity officer, the diversity officer has no resources. So that said, can you talk a little bit about where does one company start if it certainly does not have a huge platform around diversity and inclusion? Where would they start? And then let's talk about the companies that have already been doing the work, maybe the veterans, if we take those two classes. Sure. What do they need to do from your perspective?
So I think if you talk about the aspirants, right? So those that have, either just starting, or I think there is a burning platform, Stephanie. I mean, this is the burning platform. I mean, I don't think that folks can be your sideliners anymore. I just, it's just not in this day and age, in this country in particular. I just don't think they can afford to be. So I think it's the aspirants that are stepping up, and I'm getting a lot of calls, leaders, CEOs struggling. I mean, people saying to me, I had heard these stories, but I'm just beginning to realize what my privilege looks like. Now, I'm not sure where they've been, but at least there is some realization that they, something that's kind of woke in them, that they're beginning to kind of, get the messages, right? So to me, it really, in terms of, so that to me is a burning platform. In terms of starting, I do think the starting point needs to be to call out and address race. Now, even companies like Sodexo that did a lot of work over the years, there's always been this kind of reluctance to call out race, right? So it's always been, diversity. It's about everyone, let's not leave anyone behind. We talk about belonging. We talk about inclusion, which is great because that's the end goal. But in order to get there, you've got to call a spade a spade. I mean, there are issues of institutional racism. I think that this moment is providing the platform to actually name it what it is and address it for what it is, rather than wrap it in this pretty wrapper that becomes sort of palatable to the privileged and palatable to the dominant group and the oppressors. So I think it's really, the starting point is really to acknowledge that there is an issue. And let's just have a dialogue about race. And even veterans have not really done that in the same way. Right. We've sort of come to it in a different way. And along the way, kind of had the conversations about race. But now is the time to just put it on the table, have the conversation, have listening sessions, without jumping to immediate action. Because part of this is just, being able to hold the space for some safe dialogue and to be able to listen. And then from there, so that to me, that's the starting point, to do that and raise the awareness within your organization about issues of race. So broad, not just about trainings, but, have, listening sessions and be able to talk about it, have facilitated dialogue on the topic. And then from there, I would say, moving on to putting in place the initiatives that need to occur in the employee life cycle to ensure that bias, conscious and unconscious, and it's not just unconscious, it's both conscious and unconscious bias, do not, impact employee decisions. So, at every point of the life cycle, recruiting.
Can you give a couple of examples at recruiting and promotion, for example? Sure. I think people are generally interested in those stages.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. So I think if you unpack the whole sort of recruiting process, right, it goes from, sourcing to your phone screening or resume screening, phone screening, forwarding on the resumes by the recruiters to the hiring manager and then the final hiring decision. And I think every single step in that process needs to be examined for bias and mitigated by putting in place initiatives to not allow that bias to seep into decisions. So what that looks like is maybe incentives for recruiters. First of all, targets for recruiters to say you have to present a diverse candidate slate to the hiring manager because the hiring manager can't hire unless there's a diverse candidate slate. So to have that as a target, 50% of your slate has to be women and or minorities, however you define that within your context. And then putting some accountability around it, because just having the targets is not enough. The recruiters have to have accountability, and a part of their variable compensation should be linked to that, to those targets, so that we're clear that we are presenting a qualified, diverse candidate slate to the hiring manager. I then think that as I said, each point needs to be examined. But one of the other things that we've done is for the hiring manager, to provide unconscious bias training to recruiters and hiring managers. Now, unconscious bias training in itself is not that effective, but I do think it's one tool to raise awareness along with other processes and policies, so that you can mitigate bias. So I think it's a holistic approach to it. But for the hiring manager, for instance, having some targets there in terms of and scrutinizing the hiring decision. So at Sodexo, we actually had a review panel, and the review panel looked at every hiring decision, looked at who were the candidates that were sourced, what was the candidate slate that was who were the finalists forwarded, what was the candidate slate, and then who did the hiring manager hire, and really scrutinizes that whole process. So it's not just the hiring manager, and also having a diverse interview panel. So I would say, targets and incentives for recruiters, diverse recruiting interview panel, targets for hiring managers, and we actually, at Sodexo, and many companies do this, link, those targets to incentive compensation, to variable compensation, which we did as well. Globally, Sodexo had a target of, all candidate slates for certain senior level positions had to have 50% women.
50%.
So, yeah,
wow.
50% women in the candidate slate. Yeah.
In the candidate slate. That's amazing.
So so the target was 40% women by 2025. Mm-hmm. And last I saw was in senior leadership ranks was at 34%. So, inching up there. So I think that's sort of in the recruiting bucket. In the promotion, I think it's the same thing. I think, looking at using a D&I lens to look at succession planning discussions, to look at, I think all too often these discussions happen in a vacuum, or unconscious bias comes into the discussion, but also having objectives for instance, globally at Sodexo, the senior executives have a target of ensuring that a certain percentage of their successors are women or other underrepresented groups. So, ensuring that managers are held accountable for developing that talent, for retaining that talent, and then putting in place initiatives to advance, women and other underrepresented groups. So, women and minorities in the U.S. It's not about fixing, minorities or fixing women. It's not that they necessarily need more skills. It is about making them visible to the organization. It is about getting them, sponsors and mentors, so that they can, the organization can see this talent and has someone advocating for them. For decades, We've had men who've informally sponsored other men, for instance, in a very, so I think, we just need to formalize these initiatives to kind of make sure that everyone has access to sponsors or mentors. So those would be some of the initiatives. Yeah.
I'm now going to ask you the question that I'm asked most frequently, and I am certain you have been asked this question frequently, and that is, what role does merit play in this conversation? So when we start talking about making people visible and diversity and inclusion, is that a conversation that's aside from a conversation about merit? Do we just sort of throw that out the window, or how do you relate these two ideologies, if at all?
Yeah, I think, that's always an interesting conversation, right? So at the end of the day, and this is where it's sort of a, important distinction and sort of a tricky one, because at the end of the day, we want to hire the best qualified candidate. That's really the ultimate goal. But the way I look at it is, if you have two candidates, and the two candidates each have 90%, in terms of this is the threshold is 90%. and each of the two candidates has 90% of whatever is needed. One is a male, the other is a female. Then you start looking at those things that differentiate the two candidates. And one of the things in favor of the woman is you don't have that many women in your organization or your team. You know you need that diversity of thought within the organization in order to be the best organization, most productive. So you give a certain additional weight to that woman. We're not talking about, anything that is sort of that she's not qualified. It has nothing to do. It's basically looking at that threshold of of qualifications. And so I see it. I mean, I don't see the two being at odds with each other.
So many companies right now have big plans, aspirational.
And if I can just, Stephanie, can I just add one more thing to that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
It also depends on how you define as what the criteria are for a position, right?
Yeah.
And the criteria for a position includes, my life experiences. So let's not shortchange that. So
right.
Factoring that in.
Absolutely. So many companies, I was just talking to a chief diversity officer the other day. She's been in her company for 2 decades, and she has gotten a number of cold calls from a lot of companies that are looking to steal her away because apparently there's a plethora of chief diversity. I'm sure they're trying to pull you out of, what do you I think you refer to as
I'm done.
Retirement. Retirement. So there are all these open positions for diversity leaders. What's the value of a diversity officer, or what's the potential value that a diversity leader could bring to the company? I think we all realize you can't just take one person and make them the figurehead and leave it at that. But what can we be hopeful for that a chief diversity officer might bring to the table that might help us to move forward as a company broadly on diversity, broadly on issues of diversity and inclusion, but I think also on issues of racial injustice and racial equity?
Yeah, so I think, so this almost relates back to the question you asked about what veteran companies can do, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that concerns me, Stephanie, is that as companies start changing their cultures and become more inclusive, or see themselves as more inclusive, they start feeling that now, diversity is part of our DNA. We can integrate it into everything we do, and we don't need to really call it out. So we don't need, performance objective around diversity. We don't need somebody, responsible for diversity. And I think that's a really slippery slope, because just as easily as, you gain this traction, you can lose it. So I think it gives a false sense of, sort of comfort to say that now it's part of our DNA and integrated in. I think you really have to examine yourself and make sure that that is actually the case. So having said that, I think there is, not just today, I think there's tremendous value to a chief diversity officer really being able to engage cultural transformation in the organization. It's somebody who has this lens that they bring to the conversation that, others may not see. Now, we talk about white privilege and, folks are saying, well, I really didn't ever know, right? So the role of the chief diversity officer is to, to be that person that, calls out some of these things. And, basically is sort of, spurs the organization on to take action. Now, is it entirely the role of the chief diversity officer? Obviously not. I think the role of the chief diversity officer is to strategically seed allies to change people's mindsets. So it's not coming from his or her or their voice, but is coming, from change agents within the organization. I think that there's, today, of course, there's tremendous value and importance, but it's not just a symbolic thing. I think there's true value to the business. And I'll say that, Michel hired me, right, in 2002. And, he took, quotes unquote, a bit of a risk because this was an African-American, a lawsuit filed by African-American managers. I'm not African-American. And so to hire somebody that they may not identify as being an ally to them was a big risk that he took. So I think that it doesn't matter what the race or gender is of the person, but I think what is really important is the ability to listen, to make yourself vulnerable, to build these strong partnerships, and to not believe that you know everything, because I think it's important to be able to hold a space for the voice of employees. So I don't know, did I answer your question in terms of the value? And I think beyond, I would just say that beyond just the current situation and what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter and addressing issues of race, which I think is critical, I think there's also this huge benefit that the business can have. So there's a massive benefit to the business and the brand if it's done right. And we know that, addressing issues in the community is absolutely, it's about purpose-driven leadership today. So it has to be, Sorry, go ahead.
So, no, if I might add, I think it's really important that companies show the value for diversity by ensuring that diversity leaders, chief diversity officers have budgets, because if they're supposed to be accessing allies, and many of them are outside. I get contacted all the time by companies who want me to give a talk or want me to be on some external counsel. They need the resources in order to do this work, and many don't have them at all. And they're being asked to, I think, take on a huge issue without sufficient resources. So I'm going to add that to the conversation.
Absolutely.
In terms of making sure they have a substantial budget that matches the ask of them. I think sometimes we just don't treat the diversity office like a business unit, and business units need budgets to function. And I think we certainly need more of that. What would you say?
And the positioning, I would agree. And the positioning too, Stephanie, where this position reports to, to have somebody in that role reporting, like 5 levels down from the CEO. I mean, it makes no sense, because this is a strategic role. It's a role of influencing. It's a role of partnering with leaders, and it needs to be positioned as such, because otherwise it, is not effective.
So here's my last question to you, and it's certainly a selfish one. So I have spent the last 14 years really trying to understand corporate diversity and inclusion initiatives. And so if anybody asks me a question around what should companies do, I can lay out a lot of ideas, because I've been blessed to have people like you on my side, willing to open your brains and your insights up to my curiosity. What's interesting is all the work that educational institutions are trying to do. So I think of my own institution, I think of academia as a whole. Certainly, we have there's a different model in academia. We have governance structures where faculty have a lot of the say in terms of what happens, but we also have an administrative structure and a student culture and student life, and students who really want to be in an environment where they have the same advantages that employees have. Do you have any recommendations to educational institutions, universities, and colleges as they're trying to also broaden their expertise and their platforms around diversity, inclusion, and systemic racism? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. You said there's a real plethora of chief diversity officers, and what I'm seeing is a lot of education institutions are hiring chief diversity officers. I think there was an announcement recently, Harvard finally hired a chief diversity officer. So I think there's, a lot of education institutions that are realizing that they too need to, address this topic in a more sort of organized, systemic kind of manner, and that somebody responsible for it might help to get them there. And, many of them are reporting to the president, for instance, of the institution. So, I think, again, it has to be a systemic solution. It has to be holistic. it has to, I think education institutions have to address it at multiple levels. So obviously in curricula, to make sure that that lens is in the curriculum. In role models that are faculty, right? And how many tenured faculty there are that are faculty of color versus not. So I think that's, key piece of it. I think in the student body, but I think it's all interconnected, right? So as a student, my kids, when they were looking at universities, they turned down Ivy League, some Ivy League schools because they didn't see a reflection of themselves in those schools. Right. So that, for the millennials, that's an extremely important criteria today. But you can only get a diverse student body if you have those role models in the faculty, if they're curricula that reflect their life experiences and stories. So I think all this kind of, knits together. And then, of course, in the administration. But I think, again, it's a system. An academic institution is a system. And it needs to be addressed in a holistic manner. But it does have to be role modeled, and the commitment does have to come from the top. And I think, there's different structures in politics and in academic institutions, but, I personally think that the benefit, to the brand is incredible. To be known as an organization that really holds up, that's held up as a beacon for race relations, for diversity and inclusion, is going to be a magnet for future student enrollment. It's just going to happen. So that's this stuff better than I do.
But it's great coming from you, Rohini. It's really great coming from you. So final words, what would you like, different people I think are going to certainly enjoy hearing your perspectives, certainly people who you would consider colleagues, people who are professors at other institutions, my students who will be watching this video. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the current times we're facing. I would call them, as many scholars have called them, two global pandemics. One of COVID-19, the coronavirus, and the other called racism. And certainly these are contextual things that are happening here and now, but I think so many of the issues and challenges we've talked about transcend the current time. So in closing, I just wanted to give you a chance to leave us with what your thoughts are today. Maybe they're what your same thoughts were 5 years ago. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'm more hopeful today than I have ever been. I'm more hopeful because of the demographics that I see amongst the movement and the demonstrations. I'm more hopeful because of the young population, who are taking a stand. And, for them, this is about purpose. It's about values. It's not just about business case. So I think that's sort of a pivot that organizations are going to have to make. We've all been focused on the business case. And I think the pivot is going to be, this is, who we are and it's part of our values. So I'm extremely hopeful. And I think that if we just look at the movement globally and if we look at who's participating, these are change agents. So I think everyone, yes, it comes from the top, but I think this seed change can happen at all levels. So I'm really hopeful that, folks, wherever they are, will kind of look within and see how they've, the role that they play in bringing about some change and addressing racism in this country and more broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion globally.
Excellent. Well said. Dr. Rohini Anand, thank you again for allowing me to lean on you whenever I have been curious, and certainly for your willingness and your generosity in sharing your expertise and your insights with a broader audience. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dr. Creary. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.